Thank you all, and especially thank you to all the organizers. This is a really wonderful conference, and it's off to a great start, and I believe that it will keep going over the next few days.
Eigentlich soll sie dort arbeiten, soll sie entwickeln dort.
Will sie fragen?
In this clip, we hear Rachel's call to her daughter Tzina resound across a vast pastoral landscape. This evocative scene of pre-industrial rural Ashkenazi folk life was, however, far removed from the expanses of Eastern Europe. Oh, sorry. This beckon featured in the 1937 film Grine Felder, Green Fields, directed by Edgar Ulmer with screenplay by Yiddish writer Peretz Hirshbein and a score composed by Vladimir Heifetz, rang across a cheaply built set on a farm in central New Jersey. Grine Felder offers us a way into thinking about the rural setting and its characters as symbolic of both imagined nostalgic romanticism and a modern ideological promise, which, as I will argue, represent two overlapping impulses within 20th century notions of Yiddish folkness. While there exists a wealth of scholarly attention paid to Ulmer and Hirshbein, there's been little discussion of the role of sound and music within the film. In this talk, I identify and analyze the sound of characters' speech, as well as compositional features of Vladimir Heifetz's score. I argue that these sonic and musical details amplify the textual and cinematic vision of Hirshbein and Ulmer, serving as a critical nexus for the complex and evolving concept of Yiddish folkness that shaped modern Yiddish culture in the first decades of the 20th century. Grine Felder was filmed quickly and released in 1937. The plot of the film begins in a beis medrash, a Jewish house of study, where the protagonist, Levi Yitzchak, a pious student, announces his plans to set out in search of a type of spiritual fulfillment that he is unable to achieve in his present environment. Along his journey, he finds himself in a farming village where two families vie for his company. While Levi Yitzchak searches for a higher sense of purpose that he identifies with agricultural labor, the two families seek traditional Jewish learning, which they value deeply but have received in minimal quantity. Levi Yitzchak educates the children in Torah learning while they teach him to work the land, offering fulfillment to his spiritual quest. Tzina, who we met before, the ambitious daughter of one of the families, asserts her desire to marry Levi Yitzchak, a desire that he shares. The film ends with the couple walking together slowly towards the fields. Peretz Hirshbein's screenplay was adapted from his 1916 trilogy of plays Grine Felder. However, Hirshbein wrote a follow-up, Rote Felder, Red Fields, in 1935, a semi-autobiographical account of his experiences in the Jewish agricultural settlements in Soviet Crimea. I suggest that the 1937 film may be understood as a dialectic of both texts, one an evocation of pre-modern rural life, and the other historically grounded, ideologically insistent description of socialist Jewish rurality. Jim Hoberman, a leading scholar of Yiddish film, confirms the ideological tenor of Grine Felder, reflecting, quote, Grine Felder offers a multitude of positive, specifically Jewish images, but religious dogma is subdued in reverence for the Volksmensch and the redemptive power of the soil. And Hoberman specifically notes that, quote, the setting not only evokes Hirshbein's Lost Lithuania, but carries a strong subliminal suggestion of those utopian agricultural colonies founded and dreamt of by immigrant Jews in southern New Jersey. Hoberman here points not only to the political inflection of the film, but zeroes in on the way that those politics are mediated by the creator's relationship to the past, present, and future, with an attention to the material reality of contemporary Yiddish immigrant life. A press release highlights the multivalent complex of values embedded within the film. On one hand, a featured review by Kate Cameron notes that the film is, quote, based on one of Peretz Hirshbein's Jewish folktales, and is described by Eileen Creelman as a pastoral tale, a simple and refreshingly wholesome story of happy, healthy peasants in old Russia. On the other hand, a plot summary offered by New Star Films highlights, quote, Green Fields records a rapidly disappearing phase of Jewish life. For whether it be on the fields of Palestine or Birobijan, the Jewish agricultural worker is no longer ignorant or superstitious, nor awe-stricken before the stoop-shouldered and world-weary symbol of the Jewish scholar. William Edlin, an editor at the Yiddish journal Der Tog, offers his praises. Another quality is the beautiful Yiddish one hears. It is not a literary Yiddish, but a good, healthy Yiddish. That is why the talkie is of such positive cultural value. Edlin's commentary may be puzzling at first glance. After all, Hirshbein's screenplay is adapted from his earlier literary works, and the actor's speech is consistent with standard Yiddish theater performance and presented in the standard Yiddish theater dialect, a variant of Ukrainian Yiddish. On further analysis, however, Edlin's comments suggest that the sonic dimension of Grine Felder, and particularly the sound of character speech, imbue the film with a sense of authenticity that I suggest is intimately linked with the notion of folkness. So here I want to model a strategy for hearing speech as a critical expression of that folkness. The centrality of the oral in the modern concept of the folk stems at least as far as Johann Gottfried von Herder's idea of the Volksgeist. Folklorist and anthropologist Regina Bendix confirms that for Herder and his audience, folk poetry was, quote, the genuine locus of folkness, but clarifies that these were oral expressions or from the voice of the folk. Bendix directs her analysis to the constructed notions of authenticity that motivated folkloric projects, noting, quote, a critical stance against urban manners, against artifice in language, behavior, and art. Herder's influence at the intersection of folklore and culture influenced Yiddish cultural nationalism around the turn of the 20th century, which coalesced in both Eastern Europe and the United States, not only around the Yiddish language, but specifically in a desire to locate authentic Ashkenazi culture within a folk, imagined to be untouched by the effects of modernity. As historian Gabriela Safran notes of the ethnographer, writer, and left-wing activist Shin Ansky, quote, Ansky was beginning to see himself as a Jewish leader, compelled to redefine Jewishness for a post-religious era, to create or promote literature, theater, or music that could reinforce Jewish identity and satisfy the aesthetic and spiritual longings of a modern people. For Ansky, this meant folk culture, particularly that collected in a series of pioneering ethnographic expeditions to the Podolia and Volhynia regions from 1912 to 1914. Now consider the centrality of speech in ethnographer Yud Lamed Kahan's conception of Yiddish musical folklore. Now this comes from his influential 1912 collection of folk songs, where he says the songs found in this collection are echte, true, or authentic folk songs in the fullest sense of the word. Passing from mouth to mouth, from mother to child, they have been incorporated only into the folk memory until today. We have successfully put together, albeit a small selection, of the rich Yiddish song treasury that has lived in the mouth of the people, or in the mouth of the folk. This historical background scaffolds the significance of a sonic folkness that coalesces specifically in the voice of the folk. As the above examples have shown, the value system surrounding this oral folkness indexes both a retrospective and idealized nostalgia, as well as a contemporary political yearning. Now in the following, we will listen to characters' speech in Grine Felder with an ear towards notions of Yiddish folkness. Okay, so I have 3 clips here. We'll listen to them in this order.
Hast man nicht wusst, hinter sich kicken?
Kannst man nicht verwehren? Als die Master soll, sie sollte noch Leute weinen, wenn der Litzichen hier bist du nicht allergisch.
Wer weiß?
Wer weiß?
Ah, bist am Michiganer. Du bist verraten mit dir.
Ui, Sarah, Mensch, du süß. Sag doch noch, wo ein Kind. Den wolltest du dir sehen. Herrlich schütten sich vor ihm von Mäuer.
Gott heiße dich.
Pflicht wird Emes ist mit ihm. Man darf es nicht gehen weit, siehst du?
Das Licht von Emes ist mit ihm, aber wissen darf man.
Was ist der Eile nicht? Was, Bisko?
Man nimmt doch schon nach zu. So schnell schon sagt ihr nicht da weg von. Ich weiß, dass versuchen, dass du mit naja, ihr wollt doch mir Jasche sein. Esche,
Nicht du wirst reden. Oib nicht alkune. Weil auf allein. Mit allem alle Keuches. Es teits, wo es heißt.
meina, du doch früher Jesche
Man
sein.
darf doch nicht mehr Jasche sagen. Oib alkune wird nicht günstig steuer. Weil auf allein, wo es heißt da.
Meina, als ich los mich nehmen, verraten.
Aha? Wo jetzt?
Hat die Mama seine Schnapnele Mayonnaise nicht was in Dreck geschickt reden.
Ja, Fine. Mein Kind.
First, I want to hear speech volume as a symbolic indicator of space. The farming families speak loudly, signifying access to unbounded landscapes. So we heard this in the first clip of Rachel calling Titsina across the fields, and we hear it in the first and the third clip here. Levi Yitzchak, whose character develops symbolically from interior to exterior, speaks quietly with relatively little affect, although he gets a little more emotional after spending time with the family, as we heard in the third clip. We hear how the redemptive openness symbolized by the rural setting contrasts the physical and by extension sonic limitations of the urban environment, symbolized in the film by the limiting interiors within which Levi Yitzchak prays. The characters acknowledge this demographic and geographic gulf. Throughout the film, the self-proclaimed Dorfmenschen, the farm-working villagers, identified Levi Yitzchak as a city Jew, marking the encounter in terms of the social, cultural, and political distinctions between the village and the city. In addition to volume and the symbolic relationship of sound and space, I also take as significant the subtleties and the performance of dialect, which exaggerate the characters' distinctive speech patterns. While Levi Yitzchak speaks deliberately in punctuated sentences, the villagers speak with a large expressive range. In particular, they linger on the end of words and sentences. David Roski's analysis of the vital role of speech within modern Yiddish literature resonates here, helping to understand the expression of speech within a broader cultural and historical trajectory. He notes, for example, folk speech, speaking on the development of this vocal strain in modern Yiddish literature, folk speech then was proverbial speech, no longer the dead weight of the past as it was in the first stage of the evolution of the vocal strain in Yiddish literature. Folk speech was a vehicle for giving everyone a voice and giving that voice free rein. And he considers the Yiddish writer Sholem Aleichem detailing the significance of his use of what Ruskies calls the Sprach folklore, language folklore. He contrasts this slightly with the writer Yud Lamed Peretz, noting that Peretz transposed his Hasidim from the present back to the past, from the teeming metropolis back to the semi-rural shtetl. Later on, that is why the shtetl, its surrounding villages, and the third-class compartments of the train that ran along them loomed so large in their writings. They defined the boundaries of Yiddish land, the sovereign space of Yiddish. Roskies offers a perspective that locates notions of Yiddish folkness within established speech conventions that signify particular characters and archetypes. Tensions surrounding modernity, tradition, culture, politics, education, etc. are voiced through characters' speech. Hirshbein cleverly manipulates this literary tradition to portray the dialectical, nostalgic, political Yiddish folkness within the film's screenplay. We can talk about some of those details perhaps in the Q&A or later on. Of subverting that literary tradition. Where Roskies astutely recognizes the development of speech encoded within literature, we hear that speech decoded in film performance, drawing the imagined sonic character of the source text into the realm of the oral. We hear in the contrasting patterns and volume of characters' speech the ideological and cultural conflict between Levi Yitzchak's world and that of the villagers. And I suggest that given this characterization, we might understand Levi Yitzchak as the folklorist and the Dorfmenschen in the role of the folk. The contrasting speech conventions that marked the dialogue between the characters signals this distinctly modern encounter of Yiddish folklore. And it is here that we might return to William Edlin's commentary. The performed dialogue extends both the literary tradition and the physical limitations of the Yiddish theater stage. The resulting folkness of this speech aligns with notions of folk authenticity, or in Edlin's terms, a healthy Yiddish. So I now want to turn to the film's score, composed by Vladimir Heifetz. Heifetz was born in Russia in 1893 and was educated at the St. Petersburg Conservatory. Upon his immigration to the United States, Heifetz embarked on a prolific career composing and arranging music for American Yiddish organizations, as well as furnishing scores for film, TV, and radio. Now here I want to analyze how Heifetz develops specific musical materials to affirm not only the attributes of individual characters, but also to signify the terms of their interpersonal relationships. Throughout the film, Levi Yitzchak and his fellow yeshiva bochurim chant religious texts either alone or in vocal unison, with an inflection centered around a minor third. Notably, this occurs only within interior spaces, again indicating that relationship between speech and space. Heifetz transforms this chanting into the central device of the score, which develops that minor third through melodic, harmonic, and rhythmic reinvention and inversion. The Grine Felder theme, which we heard in our Nessness talk, which opens and closes the film and reoccurs conspicuously during scenes of collective farm labor, expands this device. While the religious intoning occurs around a third, the Grine Felder theme centers around fifths and sixths. Heifetz also employs a wide orchestration, with 2 octaves or more between the lowest and highest voices. As the narrative moves from the interior of the urban beis medrash to the rural farmland, there is a palpable expansion in the musical accompaniment. And we actually have, this is Heifetz's sketches from his archive that's housed at YIVO. So we can really see things change between these sketches and the final musical materials, but we can see sort of visually how he's working through some of these ideas. So let's listen first to this clip. So you can hear that minor third is a pretty central part of the sort of thematic material of the score. And now let's listen to where that expands in the Greenfields theme. Okay, and let's look at one more clip. Here we have what I like to think of as the musical complement to Ulmer's sort of famous use of light and shadow.
Wer sich dem Emmes gefunden?
Back to the Grine Felder theme.
Ist es Jiden nicht weit?
So nicht weit wollen Jiden.
Ist da Jiddisch Hingo?
Okay. And it is worth noting as well that the Grine Felder theme is sung by a choir as opposed to the instrumental that provides the rest of the film's musical backing. Choral singing was the dominant setting of Yiddish song, particularly folk song in the early 20th century, and was associated with left-wing organizations such as the Arbeiter Ring and the International Workers' Order. The IWO-affiliated Jewish Music Alliance, which sponsored and facilitated a wide network of so-called folk choruses, was, for example, aligned with the Communist Party. Now, Vladimir Heifetz was actively involved with the Jewish Music Alliance as a composer, arranger, and an educator. So if we understand the film as being at least partially informed by Peretz Hirshbein's Soviet experiences, we might also consider Vladimir Heifetz's ideological affiliation with the Jewish Music Alliance as motivating his compositional output. Now, Soviet ethnomusicologist Moshe Beregovsky offers a perspective on Yiddish folk song that provides some insight into the Jewish Music Alliance communist-affiliated outlook. Beregovsky rejected earlier folk ethnographies of figures like Ansky and Kahan as affirming bourgeois nationalism. He states, "In Jewish musical and oral folklore, the bourgeois ideologues sought and found an extensive national spirit, a crystal pure folk soul." But Beregovsky counters, claiming, quote, "Folklore is not something ossified, not an art made once and for all according to some eternal, unchanging, and metaphysical national spirit. The national specificity of folk music is a historically developed national form which reflects specific social and economic content." And I note here that a great deal of Beregovsky's fieldwork actually took place in the Yiddish-speaking agricultural colonies in Soviet Crimea. So thinking about Yiddish songs that became popular in the American folk revival, John Koya comes from Beregovsky's fieldwork, or at least as American audiences knew it, comes from Beregovsky's fieldwork. I suggest that Heifetz's compositional strategies emphasize this outlook by musically developing and reimagining musical indices of Yiddish folkness to emphasize the vital, evolving nature of Yiddish culture in the modern era. Now, with this framework in mind, I want to return to the character of Tzina, and I want to show how Heifetz suggests the modern character of Yiddish folkness through her associated musical motifs. So let's take a quick look here. Quick listen. Look and a listen. Tzina's central motive is a springy melody that expands from a minor key scalar pattern to octave leaps on the minor third and the flat five. These melodic choices are situated within a decidedly diminished harmony. We may hear this diminished motive in a number of overlapping ways. We might first hear this as a suggestion of folk melodic chromaticism, evoking Central and Eastern European folk musics in particular. More significantly, though, this harmonic decision highlights modern compositional impulses, including both contemporary European art musics as well as the influence of modern Black music in the United States, including ragtime, jazz, and blues. While the diminished mode typically signals a type of yearning and non-resolution, I offer that we can hear this undecidability not only within Tzina's psychological development, but in the ambivalent encounter with modernity. Tzina's first scene is followed shortly by the introduction of her father, David Neuer, a man immensely proud of his Jewishness and also his status as a Dorfmensch. David Neuer's theme suggests the Freygish mode, with close intervals highlighting the flat 2 and a harmonic turn to the minor 4 chord associated with this traditional Ashkenazi scale. The fact that this theme is played on a clarinet and performed by the Russian clarinetist Simeon Belasin is yet another layer of significance that we could perhaps discuss during the Q&A. Against the relatively stable, if slightly exoticized David Neuer theme, we might hear Tzina's motif as signifying her potential as a woman in the modern era, breaking with traditionalism of previous generations to form a new contemporary identity. As the story progresses, Tzina confides in her mother that she loves Levi Yitzchak and desires to marry him. As before, this diminished motive not only highlights Tzina's psychological uncertainty, but also expresses contemporary harmonic sensibilities. Let's take a listen to that.
Mama, so fijn. Zeynor, of je lacht me niet. Dat heb ik niet verstanden. Dat kan je niet. Kan je niet maken, mijn kind. Dat stinkt niet, man. Je hoeft toch te verstehen. Huh? Wat doet ze meest te goed? Mijn kind, ik
In this compositional setting, we can hear Tsina's encounter with modern cosmopolitanism. The conclusion in the narrative of the story, which I argue is amplified in Heifetz's score, is not the exclusive embrace of one or the other ways of life, but the enriching dialectical relationship between tradition and modernity that characterized Yiddish culture in the 20th century. Speech and music in Grine Felder allow us to hear the complex and conflicted engagement with the Yiddish past, present, and future, expressed through the multivalent character of the Yiddish folk. And this is one key reason why, in the words of William Edlin, the talkie is of such positive cultural value. Thank you.
I want to ask you about the nest and focus, since one of the previous speakers went on so tediously about that earlier. But I will ask, hearing that score, even if I hadn't known it was St. Peter's Conservatory, I would have known it was St. Petersburg Conservatory. It's got all those touches. Even the combination of sort of Jewish themes with a balalaika background. And I sort of wonder how much of this style really comes right out of that. It sounds like Mussorgsky and Rimsky and all the people who were taught and featured in that school.
Yeah, so admittedly, it's not something I know as much about, although I will absolutely look into it as I continue this. But what I will say is, as I mentioned, coming into those, like the Tsina motive, those sort of diminished harmonies, that at first I was very tempted to just hear those as folk, sort of references to kind of folk melodies. But then I realized that it was really expressing more of this kind of modern harmonic sensibility. So to that extent, his training around the turn of the 20th century, in that conservatory setting, and then coming to the United States and working in the art music tradition in terms of his relationship with the Jewish Music Alliance, but then also in these more commercial settings, kind of merging those impulses. And I absolutely think that it's significant, especially for Heifetz, to note that he was this kind of cosmopolitan Russian. So again, the specifics of the sort of compositional influence, I'll definitely continue to look into. But this notion that is the kind of background he's coming from. He's not coming from Jewish quarter in Warsaw. He's not coming from a shtetl. He's coming from that sort of social and, I guess, musical background.
Can I just quickly ask?
Please.
So even if you have a so-called authentic substance, by the time it's presented in a film, its authenticity can only be affected through artifice, right? So you have to create an illusion of authenticity. So is the tension between authenticity and artifice what you mean by folkness?
Between authenticity and artifice. I think it is what I mean by, it is definitely what I mean by folklore. So when I said something about folklore being this quintessentially modern thing, what I mean is not that the folk materials themselves are necessarily modern, but this engagement with them, which is very much rooted in an imagined sense of authenticity, but is not only sort of collected, but also then represented through certainly artificial means, or through an artifice of whether it was Ansky's fiction, Joel Engel's sort of folk compositions, things like that. And so but I think that does come into what I mean by folkness, in the sense that it is the concept of, here it's the concept of folkness. It's the concept, and that's why I was so struck by those reviews. And they have, later in that sort of press kit, what they call exploitation angles. So how you're going to promote the film. And this is exactly that. They want to project a sense of folkness, of authenticity through that folkness. So whether that is what actually materializes, how it materializes, is sort of what I wanted to get into a little bit today. It's something we can continue to talk about. But certainly that sense of folkness was the goal in terms of reaching audiences. Yeah.
Thank you for this. I have a question about the Jewish Music Alliance.
Yes.
Can you say a little more about that, and then I'll see
Yes.
if my question is relevant?
Okay. Yeah, so the Jewish Music Alliance was founded in 1924. It was associated with the International Workers' Order, and then by extension, the Jewish Fraternal People's Order, founded by Jacob Schaefer in 1924. Like I said, they had this network of choruses. So originally they were called the Freiheit Gesangverein, and they were associated with the Morgenfreiheit, which was the Communist Journal.
Yeah.
And then they became sort of known as folk choruses, although I think their official name was like Jewish Philharmonic Choruses. So the composers who were involved with the Jewish Music Alliance sort of, and this was another thing of going into the archive to just see how extensively they were writing for, not only for the choirs, which they were amateur choirs, but it was professionals writing the music, but then for community events, for school programs, for things like this. So they were really invested in the kind of the sort of musical education within this Yiddish communist American space.
So it is American-based?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
I'm just wondering, because Sina's theme sounds so much like Hans Eisler's circa 1930.
Okay.
And I'm just wondering if he is circling through that when he comes to the United States. I mean, I don't think of him as being affiliated with Yiddish, but I mean, the man's trying to make a living, right? So maybe in the U.S., I don't know. It just sounded so much like him when you played that theme. I was just curious if there's a leftist connection there.
His name does pop up, and I want to see if I get lucky and see if it happens to be in this one particular program. Again, the title here, Gesang und Kampf. Oh yeah, in the first, is that you said Hans Eisler? No.
I did, yeah.
Oh yeah, so the first one, the music, Auf die Gasse zu singen.
Yep. With one N, which
Yeah.
is small, but it is the right
So exactly right. So there was an overlap in that. Yeah.
All right, thank you. That's very interesting. Thank you.
One more quick question,
Okay.
and then we will take a break.
Sure.
I was fascinated by this conversation of the linguistic and the musical aspects, so thanks so much for excavating this for us. I have an observation and then a question. So
Yes,
my
please.
observation is that the contrast you draw between the literary Yiddish and the pure Yiddish is one that comes up in the Yiddish theater. Of course, the Deutschmarisch being rejected by Gordon and his followers in favor of something more natural, more pure. And I'm wondering if you think that debate is rooted in the Yiddish theater, since so much of Yiddish film came out of the creators of Yiddish theater, or if you think they came to it by some other route.
Yeah, I think that they absolutely did, but I think that the Yiddish, the sort of modern Yiddish literary space, and the theater space were so overlapped in such important ways. I mean, even going back to the Donna Donna thing, right? That Zeitlin was, he wrote for the theater, but he was a poet, he was a writer, sort of outside of that. So I think one of the things that's happening here as well is that there is this question of what is considered pure and what is considered. I want to frame this exactly right, because there are these inversions from the expectation, especially from the literary. So what we might expect from the literary tradition, I'll just say, is that who would be doing the most quoting, let's say, of sort of religious passages in their everyday life would have been the Dorfmenschen, the Tevias, as opposed to the Levi Yitzchaks, and so there is sort of an inversion there. But at every turn, what that's doing is sort of setting up one type of group to be this sort of pure folk, or like the folk, and another group not to be. So that plays out certainly like in the text, and then I would imagine the decisions that they made, for example, the way that they have that real Galicianer kind of like lingering on the end of words, things like that would have come out of the theater, and these expectations around character types being, because one thing when I say dialect, which is sort of interesting here, it's not as if the Levi Yitzchak character is speaking in like a Litvish Yiddish. They're all speaking in it's all the theater dialect. So it's these things happening. It's like these performance decisions. For example, he speaks, like I said, very punctuated. The Dorfmenschen, they sort of linger on the words. They're a little bit louder. So it's performance decisions which are actually drawing out what would otherwise be kind of like dialect distinctions. So I have to imagine certainly that it not only comes out of the literary tradition, but then also the theater. And I think what is so interesting here, though, is that, again, going back to the space, where even though this was not filmed in like an Eastern European shtetl, it was filmed on a farm. So you have theater actors who presumably are used to performing in theaters, now being able to kind of transfer or translate all of that training, all of those conventions, with actually like literal access to so much space. So, so to answer your question, certainly it comes out of conventions in the theater, but I think that those are intimately connected with the conventions from literature.